In this section, we'll look at how America finally entered the war, covering the period from Wilson's re-election in 1916 for about 6 months later until we finally declared war in April 1917. Anyway, after his victory in the 1916 election, Wilson felt freer to push a more idealistic, more progressive plan for peace. Now, as mentioned in the Age of Reform lecture, progressives were optimistic that experts could solve the problems of the world. The problem of war, Wilson surmised, was that the victors usually suppressed the losers, fairly or not. To the victor go the spoils, the old saying went. To Wilson, this ensured a revenge motive, a vindictiveness that perpetuated war. If, Wilson surmised, there was a, quote, peace without victory, a peace where no one would unfairly annex another or pay any indemnities, a peace whereby experts redrew the boundaries fairly and equitably, there would be, less likelihood of war. Progressivism had grown from the local to the state and to the national level, and now Wilson appeared to be advocate a post-war international reform. Wilson unveiled his peace without victory plan for peace in a speech to Congress on January 22nd, 1917. Unfortunately, the plan fell on deaf ears. The British still seemed intent upon achieving a major victory to win leverage in any negotiations, and the Germans at that very moment were recalculating their situation. In the period 1915 through 1916, with first the Arabic Pledge and then the Sussex Pledge, the Germans had calculated that it was best to give ground to Wilson's demands on submarine warfare to keep the United States out of the war. In short, they still had hoped to break the Allies' trenches, even if the Allies still had some trade with the United States. By the time of Wilson's Peace Without Victory speech in January 1917, however, the German military leaders had sort of convinced the civilian leaders that continuing to restrict the submarine warfare would ensure Germany's loss. If the status quo continued, Germany would lose the war of attrition in the West. Accordingly, only 9 days after Wilson's Peace Without Victory speech, Germany replied by announcing that as of February 1st, 1917, U-boats would sink all ships, belligerent or neutral, without warning, in a broad zone extending around Great Britain, France, Italy, and the eastern Mediterranean. The German government would allow only one ship to sail weekly between New York City and Falmouth, England, provided that the ship was suitably marked. Angered, on February 3, 1917, Wilson then broke diplomatic relations with Germany. 3 weeks later, the British informed Wilson that they had intercepted and decoded a secret cable from the German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German ambassador in Mexico City. The Zimmermann note declared that if the United States and Germany went to war, the German's ambassador was to propose to the Mexican government an alliance with Germany. If Mexico would join the German war against the United States, Germany would assure Mexico that it received, quote, the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, unquote. In essence, much of the territory Mexico had lost to the United States in the Mexico-American War of 1848. Germany's plan made sense. The United States intervention in Mexico earlier during Wilson's presidency, mentioned in the imperialism lecture, had angered many Mexicans. Germany, of course, did not think Mexico would defeat the United States, but they knew that if war broke out on the American-Mexican border, the American troops' first priority would be to defend America's borders. In other words, the war with Mexico would slow down the time it took for the American troops to arrive in force in Europe against Germany. And the lag time between the American declaration of war and the arrival of American troops in mass in Europe, Germany would have time to launch one final offensive to break the Allied trenches. While Mexico, of course, said it had no plans to ally with Germany, the Zimmermann note further outraged Wilson. Wilson, the idealistic son of a minister who saw the world in terms of right and wrong, the progressive who saw a need to reform, and a man that still largely saw warfare in the 19th century chivalrous terms, reacted forcibly. First, Wilson requested congressional authority to arm American merchant ships and to use the U.S. Navy to protect commerce. Southern and Western Democrats, the neo-isolationists in Wilson's own party, still resisted. As this debate began anew, Germany followed up its announcement by sinking 3 United States merchant vessels in March 1917, all with great loss of life. Wilson decided he'd go directly to Congress and ask for a full declaration of war, but he needed to outline the American motives in clear and idealistic terms to ensure a majority. Returning to his peace without victory plan, Wilson declared that if America entered the war, it could help determine its outcome. Implicit was that the United States would do things differently than victors in earlier wars. The United States would lead an international reform movement that would make the world, quote, safe for democracy, unquote, a slogan that became famous. This time, he argued, it was right because Europe was devastated, and the opportunity to redraw boundaries and start anew with an unbiased experts leading the way was just too great to miss. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson appeared before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war. The Senate approved the resolution on April 4th, and 2 days later the House concurred. The votes, however, were far from unanimous, 82-6 in the Senate and 373-50 in the House. One of the negative votes in the House was cast by Jeannette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist, and the first woman elected to national office. The fact that the desire to go to war was not unanimous meant, of course, that throughout the war the government had to create a lot of public support for it just to ensure that the war effort went on unbroken. This concludes the section on America's entrance to the World War I.